The NBA trade deadline, a staple in the league that most teams use to beef up their roster and make one last move before heading into the tail end of the season. Well, this year, the implications from this trade deadline are far more reaching than just this year's NBA Finals. Obviously, there was the massive league-shaking move that saw the Lakers deal with the devil live on as they somehow managed to finesse the Mavs into giving them another generational talent to add to their unbroken line of superstars arriving in the city of LA. That trade is one we already talked about in our last video that you should definitely check out after this one. But behind that massive story, there are still a bunch of other really interesting moves, like the Bucks sending their homegrown star off to the purgatory Washington Wizards, or the Raptors paying pennies on the dollar for Masai's favorite type of player, a 6'8" wing. So to make sure that the fans that are still shell-shocked from the Luka AD trade are all caught up, I'm going to break down every other major transaction from the 2025 NBA trade deadline.
I got to go. It wasn't a matter of if, but where Jimmy Butler would go, and it is Golden State.
Rob Pelinka, boy, masterclass of how to finesse, boy. Yeah, Mark Williams.
And I immediately fell to my knees, but I am composed myself, and I promise I'm not gonna go too off the rails. How did the Bulls walk out of here with 0 picks again?
As I mentioned at the start, we've dedicated an entire video exclusively covering the Luka AD trade, so that's not going to be one I'm going to talk about here today. However, despite the big names that were involved in that deal, it's likely that that won't be the most impactful trade for this current season. Both the Lakers and Mavs had a lot of groundwork to make up prior to the trade. And although there are some fans that are already willing to crown the Lakers as the eventual champs for some reason, there are already legitimate contenders that only got stronger through this deadline. Immediately, the Cleveland Cavaliers come to mind, who made a last-minute move shipping out Caris LeVert, George Niang, and 3 second-rounders for DeAndre Hunter. This finally gives the Cavs some more defense on the wing, something we mentioned on this channel that the Cavs needed to do if they wanted to be serious competitors in the playoffs, as they just didn't have the depth at that position previously to attempt to guard a team like the Celtics over a 7-game series. But now that Cleveland squad is a lot more well-rounded. So although that move might not be as headline grabbing as, say, Jimmy going to the Warriors, which I will talk about in a minute, those are still all moves that need to be considered when reflecting back on this deadline. But I know most people just want to hear the bigger moves, so let's get into them. First up, as promised, is the kind of anticlimactic ending to the drama-filled saga between Jimmy Butler and Pat Riley. Although this never reached James Harden levels of desperation, it did seem like for a little bit there that Pat was willing to drag down his entire franchise just to spite Jimmy. And at the same time, somehow, despite Jimmy dragging a glorified G League team to the finals, most of the blame and anger was placed upon him. Look, I know it looks bad that a 35-year-old is asking for $50 million a year. But in his eyes, if Pat's just gonna sit on his hands year after year and be the tough old man that no one wants to deal with as Donovan Mitchell, Kevin Durant, and countless other all-stars pass by them, well, then you might as well just pay Jimmy the money if you're not gonna go out and give it to someone else. But all of that's irrelevant now, as Jimmy was dealt to the Warriors and signed a 2-year, $121 million contract extension only minutes after the trade announcement. In the final hours of the deadline, however, there were plenty of reports that the Warriors were basically just reaching out in regards to every single all-star in the league. So bringing in Jimmy and instantly paying him kind of reeks of desperation to try and keep Steph happy. So we'll see if a trade works out under these conditions, especially with the very friendly, warm personalities of both Jimmy Butler and Draymond Green as they share the court together. This deal was a massive 5-team trade, but realistically, only the Warriors and Heat really matter, as the other moves were just the Raptors winning the PJ Tucker sweepstakes and Dennis Schroeder ending up on his 4th team within 24 hours. So to look at the Heat side of things, in return, they got Andrew Wiggins and Kyle Anderson from the Warriors, and somehow managed to finesse Davion Mitchell out of the Raptors, which now probably makes the Heat the team that other teams in the league hate playing the most. Between Bam, Wiggins, Davion, and many more, this team has an abundance of defense to shut down everyone else's offense. But speaking of offense, the Heat were pretty piss poor in that category even before Jimmy left. So without Miami picking up another true scorer, it's going to be tough for them really to compete. Even if they hold teams under 100, they'd still have what would basically be a Herculean task for them of trying to get over 100 points. So we may be looking at a classic case of a lose-lose scenario.
Do you want to pursue a lose-lose negotiation?
The next move we'll be looking at is the one that saw De'Aaron Fox end up in San Antonio and Zach LaVine down in Sacramento. This was a 3-team trade between the Bulls, Kings, and Spurs. The Bulls kind of fumbled. Sure, Trey Jones is a solid player, and they did get back a first-round pick. But it's the Spurs pick in this upcoming draft, and they were already floating around a 500 team, and without giving up too many player assets for Fox, that record's only gonna get better. So that pick probably isn't gonna give them much of a return. And that's still ignoring the fact that the Bulls were expected to get a lot more picks when they finally shipped LaVine out. So I would say the direction of this team is just kinda up in the air at the moment, and for the most part, I don't think this deadline went how Bulls fans were expecting it to go. The Sacramento Kings, on the other hand, are now just the Bulls from last year with a different Eastern European big man. A much better one, but ultimately I'd say the Kings are still looking like one hell of a play-in team. And as for the Spurs, this is a good move. During last year's offseason, we made a video addressing some of the things that the Spurs did wrong during Wemby's rookie season. And basically what we said is that they need to go out and get an actual point guard to pair beside Wemby, even suggesting Chris Paul at the time. Another possible player that they could go out and get is Chris Paul. Well, they went out and did exactly that. The other thing we mentioned, although not as urgent as the need for a point guard, is that it would probably be within the Spurs' best interest to try and strike early with Wemby and find a legit star to pair him with. And once again, they've gone out and done just that. And since picking him up, you can see the faster pace at which the Spurs are playing at, and the blueprint to success behind Victor and De'Aaron Fox is starting to form shape. Honestly, this is just one of my favorite trades for the entire deadline and should lead to some really exciting basketball. Now time to talk about the one that Lakers fans probably won't want to hear. Since the initial trade that brought Anthony Davis to LA, the Lakers have been pretty short on draft picks. And they were really hoarding their last 2 picks close to their chest, saving them up for when they could use them to go all in. Well, this year apparently is that year. They sent the first one off to the Mavs for Luka, obviously the right thing to do. Even if they asked for the second one, you would still probably send it. But thankfully, Nico Harrison is way too stupid to ask for both. And so they had that final pick teed up and ready to be sent out the door, and in return, they got Mark Williams. Just kidding, this trade got rescinded in the middle of writing this video. But since I wrote down what I think, and I think it's a pretty good take, I'm gonna talk about it anyways. As all of you now know if you didn't before, the Lakers just recently canceled that trade, with the explanation saying, quote, not satisfying one of the conditions of the trade, end quote, with Shams later clarifying that there were multiple injury issues that the Lakers believed would hold Mark back. However, despite the hype that this move was generating from Lakers fans, the fact that it's not happening anymore may be a blessing in disguise. Yes, from the eye test, Mark passes it all, extremely athletic and a dominant force, but that's when he's actually on the court. This is Mark's 3rd season in the NBA, and at the time of writing this video, he's had the opportunity to suit up for 212 games. But he's only ever played in 85 of those games, meaning that he's been injured for 60% of his time in the NBA. And Mark just isn't that special of a player to where the 40% that he's actually available for outweighs the 60% that he's not. So when considering that there are additional injuries that caused the Lakers to void the trade, was this even really a player you wanted to develop alongside Luka to begin with? Who himself isn't exactly known for his durability either. The Lakers are probably just better off with their pick or using that pick to find a more reliable big this offseason. Not to mention the explosive streaks we've seen from Mark has happened while being on the Hornets, a terrible bottom tier team. So you gotta ask yourself, how legit is Mark Williams? Well, if you go back to a time before he was on the Hornets when he was still in college, I think that paints more of a truer story. He's a solid big man, but nothing special, and he's probably not gonna help bring the Lakers past a team like the Thunder, Nuggets, or even the Rockets. Some Laker fans were hyping up the fact that he just dropped a 2015 game against Jokic. But they conveniently ignore the fact that Jokic had 28 points, 17 rebounds, 13 assists, and 4 steals, which truly paints the bleak difference in talent that Mark is going to have to face in the West compared to what he's had in the East. Next up is the deal between Washington and Milwaukee, with Kyle Kuzma ending up on the Bucks and Chris Middleton ending up on the Wizards. It's no secret that Middleton has been slowly on the decline since the Bucks' 2021 championship run. A lot of his injury struggles, unfortunately, are catching up to him, slowing him down. So much so that Doc Rivers felt that Chris needed to be moved to the bench. And you know you fucked up when Doc Rivers takes a former All-Star out of the starting lineup. I mean, he needs somebody to throw under the bus. So ultimately, it was just time for Chris and the Bucks to part ways before his value was dwindled down too much. And so they sent him off to the Wizards, finally freeing Kyle Kuzma from 4 years of what can only be described as the basketball team equivalent to waiting in a line. Just a whole lot of standing around, doing nothing, waiting for the time you can finally leave. So it's at this point where we're gonna leave Middleton in that line, and now look at the Bucks side of things, where they now have a new big three, I guess. Honestly, it feels like it's been so long since we've seen Kuz on a team that's actually trying to win a basketball game that it's kind of tough to call this one. But with Giannis playing out of his mind like usual, and Dame looking a lot more comfortable on the Bucks for year 2, there really shouldn't be a whole lot of expectations placed on Kuz. And ultimately, if they can overcome having Doc Rivers as their coach, they might be able to make some noise in the East. And finally, for the last big trade of the deadline, we have Brandon Ingram getting shipped off to the Raptors for Bruce Brown, Kelly Olynyk, a first, and a second-round pick. Objectively, Brandon Ingram doesn't really fit in this team. I do like pairing him up with Scotty Barnes, but with RJ Barrett and Quickley still on the team, it leaves the wing spot congested, and it's not like you can move Scotty to the point when you still have Quickley there. But also, when you look at how little the Raptors had to give up for a guy that's averaging 25-4 for his career, there is some logic in the move. Giving away the first round pick isn't ideal, but it is a Pacers pick for this upcoming draft, so it's not like it's the most valuable pick to begin with. And other than that, you have to look at it like you were able to turn 2 bench guys into a former All-Star, who by all appearances is stoked to be out of New Orleans and in Toronto. So when stepping back and looking at the whole picture, the Raptors were able to flip Siakam and OG into Ingram, RJ, Quickley, Ochai Agbaji, and Jacoby Walter, who seems like a promising young talent. So although this roster may not make sense on paper, if we're just looking at it from a pure asset standpoint, the Raptors now have a better bargaining chip should they choose to ship Ingram out after building up his value alongside a great playmaker like Scotty B. Obviously, this isn't every single transaction. Honestly, a lot of them are just inconsequential, like the Atlanta Hawks for some reason being a last-minute buyer, as well as other moves that are just straight up diabolical and seem like they were done just to fuck with the minds of every other GM, like the first-seeded OKC Thunder, for some reason picking up Daniel Tice just to get one more pick to add to their gold mine of a stash. However, there is one team that I need to mention, not for any specific move, but just as a whole. The Charlotte Hornets definitely get an A+ coming out of this deadline. They are finally positioning themselves to have an actual rebuild with a goal in mind, and grabbing a few first-round picks and Dalton Connect is a really good piece to add to this rebuild. So alongside the Luka and Anthony Davis trade, there are plenty of others that are sure to shake up the league for years to come.